So please, I think I'm willing to see if anybody with the real physicist and the chemistry people can, and the engineers can correct me, type thing. So.
Barat, I have 10:02 on my watch, so you said
No, that's right. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a wall clock that is losing time. That's the whole thing. We moved it from. Okay, yeah. So we may as well get started. So this is day 2. So, and I think I apologize for overdoing it on physics last week, but I thought some introduction was warranted to give an idea as to what real anisotope is, and go back to our high school chemistry and physics as to learn what. And some of these people, they were historical, and they were worth mentioning because they were like as Jay mentioned earlier, they were the giants of. And hopefully we've started the recording. I think yeah, it says so.
Yeah, I started the recording a few minutes ago.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, so this is so today we will get into the real history. So this is exactly the first part. So we got over some of the basic science that was sort of mandatory to keep up with the subject material. So, and this is atomic age day 2, and this is somewhere where we ended up with that because of the pioneering work of the Cavendish lab, the Brits were far ahead, and then obviously they were under the fire. So they were in the war from 39. So they had the real incentive to keep an eye on the Germans, and obviously they had a lot of close information because the U.S. spying network was laughable at that time. It was almost like some of the OSA and other stuff was like, they were understaffed, underfunded, and they just did not have any serious attempt. But the Brits were in the cloak and dagger business a lot longer, so they knew about it. And as you may recall, these were the German immigrant scientists who actually calculated, yes, that this is not all lab research, that we actually could build, based on the amount we talked about the chain reaction as the amount of milli-electron volts that were released from fission of uranium, as to that how much energy could be released and how much amount of raw material isotope, so to speak. So they did so obviously there was a lot of theoretical physics and maths. So Peirce and Frisch did the calculation, and obviously just like in London, they were important enough to get their own plaque that they said, okay, this is doable. We don't need 10,000 pounds of uranium-235. So they actually came up with the idea that yes, even with as little as 15 kilograms, we could come up with. And they came up also there. Obviously, the thinking was amazing that the two hemispheres can actually do the explosion type of thing. So that was a proposition. So it wasn't all theory. That's what the point. And they were at University of Birmingham. So not all of them were at Cavendish, but there were 4 major universities that were working on it: Manchester, Birmingham, and obviously Cambridge. Now, obviously, we forget the other side, that the Russians were no pushover at that time, because on their own, independently, and there was enough collaboration between the scientists, and a scientist named Georgy Flernow. On his own, he had discovered chain reactions, so it wasn't all espionage and other things. And he had written just the same way Einstein had written. This was interesting piece of history, that he had written a letter to Comrade Stalin that yes, that this is possible, that we could make the bombs type of thing. And initially, and he persisted because, I'm sorry, yeah. So, and he persisted because he was not, really a high-ranking party members, but his idea was accepted type of thing. And so much so that finally, I'm sorry? Yeah, okay. So, and his ideas were accepted, and then so much so that Stalin appointed his KGB chief, the notorious Beria, they said, okay, go ahead with it, no matter what the cost, type of thing. And, obviously they thought it was an easier way. And we'll talk a lot more when we talk about the Klaus Fuchs attempt. But just to introduce that, the Russians were not behind. And on their own, they had made attempts at getting ahead. And the more important was the British effort, which kind of needled and lit the fire under the American this thing. And so they were, and we talked about James Chadwick, who, okay, hopefully everybody's muted because I'm getting a bit.
Yeah,
okay.
I muted everybody. I muted everybody, Bharat. So
okay, yeah. So I think so. And James Chadwick, who's in the middle, and he was the one who had discovered neutron from last week's, and that so British finally, based on the information that was coming out in Pearl's and Frisch's calculation, they said, okay, well, we need to get a bit organized, and the 4 universities got involved in the project, and they established, well, I mean, obviously in the time, because of secrecy, they wanted to all give this secretive name. And so they gave an attempt called MOD report. So military, and so that was established. And later on, they gave another acronym called tube alloys, and that was given because it was involved with metallurgy and the tube alloys. So just to mislead people, various names were given. And obviously getting the raw material was the big thing. And as I mentioned, that the Belgians had the monopoly from Congo, from their colonies. So that was the big source as to how to purchase, while the Germans had the advantage because of the mines in Eastern Europe. And I may butcher the name, but Joachim Stahl mines. So those were, they had the head start through the raw material type of thing. So the Brits, and actually they decided, okay, well, they were short on the resources, but they were strong in laboratory and theoretical because of their head start that they had. So obviously they offered to collaborate with Americans. Okay, and now, and several scientists now, this particular gentleman needs to be mentioned because he is sort of an outlier type of thing. So it was all of the scientists, obviously they were so petrified of the German effort, and that they did not have any qualms about going ahead with the development of these, to use the cliche, weapon of mass destruction. But this is Joseph Rotblat. I thought deserves mention. He was a Polish immigrant to UK, and just in tongue-in-cheek, he would say, that I'm a Pole with a British passport. And he had done work initially with the British effort of tube alloys, and was later on loaned the Manhattan Project. And the reason why he's important, because with the development of the project, he finally had enough objection that he decided to leave the project, because most of the scientists who were drafted in the Manhattan Project, they just, okay, we're doing it for our nation, and even though they were not told exactly what their duties were going to be or what their jobs were going to be, they just went along with it. But he was one of the few exceptions that he left you to, says, okay, I don't, and obviously I mentioned the lady who was pioneer of chain reaction, Lisa Meitner. She had said, okay, I don't want anything to do with the bomb, if you may recall from the last week's slides. But he is another man who has actually had strong conscious objections type of thing. And sorry, my slide is a little goofy. I should have cleaned it up a bit. And at the same time, because he was showing objections, General Groves, who was military and very suspicious of everybody except for staunch military people, he thought this guy was a Russian spy. That's one of the reasons why he wanted to quit. And then he thought, well, that they might want to defect to the Soviet Union, because he was interested in taking flying lessons, so to speak. Said, well, he might want to join the Air Force, Royal Air Force, so he could fly to Poland and defect to the Soviet Union. And there were some of his papers were stolen while he was on a train. And later on, even after this end of the war, he worked on the nuclear fallout and partial test ban treaty. And he was, so this is a little piece of history that is digressing, but it's worth mentioning at this time. Okay. Now, again, just getting into more details on the British effort, that they had developed, in 1940s, that sufficiently critical mass could be developed, and they also convinced in the Americans, because there were several Americans who were strong Anglophiles and obviously staunchly anti-Nazi, especially the gentleman that we'll talk about named, Vannevar Bush and James Conant, and they had uh, gone to England and had had meetings with the British scientists and were convinced FDR that, I'm sorry, I should have, okay, uh, and the British effort involved ICI, which is the big industrial chemical giant, and the other person who was involved leading the Maud report was George P. Thompson. If you recall from last week, J.J. Thomson was the first one, in 1896, discovered the electron. Okay, he was even preceded even Ernest Rutherford, and this is his son. So both father and son were Nobel laureates. So just not that common. There are only a couple of father, Marie Curie and her daughter were the Nobel winners, but this is a piece of science history that you may get a kick out of, that George P. Thompson. He got a Nobel Prize later on for electron diffraction, but we shan't dwell into that. But and so he was one of the head. And not to say the least, Winston Churchill was enthusiastic for and supportive for the science project. And that is, later on when we talked about the Churchill and Roosevelt relationship, we'll talk as to how much role he had to play. And for a politician, he was ahead of his time, and he was supportive of. And again, if you have seen the movie about about the British radar effort and the computer effort, Turing's life, you can see that the Churchill supported the projects, but we are digressing. So he was supportive compared to some of the other more traditional politicians. Okay, so enough said about that, and we can talk for, I'm sorry, I should move my toolbar so it doesn't block my, all right, okay, we're in business now. Okay, so this was, and this is interesting to their credit, because we mentioned last week that Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, with their mega cyclotrons, they were able to discover the new artificial element plutonium. We'll talk more about Glenn Seaborg later on. But the Brits on their own had also discovered that, yes, plutonium is the next element in the row, element 94. And so there are varieties of efforts. So certainly they had more than share. And even later on, when the Americans and the British effort were combined, several of their scientists traveled to the United States. And there was a mixed blessing in both ways, that obviously they were of tremendous help in providing the intellectual power. But also they were kind of laid back in terms of screening, and that led to the Russians getting all the secrets. Now, again, obviously enough credit needs to be given to the leader of the free world at that time, the FDR. We talked a little bit about his response to the letter that was delivered to him. And there's several stages, again, of more than one slide for this, because it is obviously he was very instrumental in getting the whole ball rolling. And initially, the advisory committee on uranium was formed. And obviously, as typically of government, various committees were formed. Some were efficient, some were very laid back and took their own sweet time. And the first attempt that was given was that, if we recall, that Leo Szilard, who came up with the idea of chain reaction as an explosive device, he had finally migrated to America and Colombia from Britain. And he and Enrico Fermi wanted to repeat the German experiments, and they were given the funding to buy something called the moderator, which slows down the transfer of the neutron during the chain reaction. And so they were given the funding. And obviously, when it comes to at $6,000, doesn't sound like much, even for Second World War, but obviously that was their initial grant to And a lot of the work initially was done at University of Columbia, and subsequently, I can't figure out how Fermi later on moved to Chicago, but academics they've traveled from one place to the other. And so this was some of the earlier efforts that were done on this side of the Atlantic. And again, and now and at the same time, the other big advantage was that the immigration from exile from Germany that took place as to and the names are like the who is he or who is who of science. A guy named Hans Bethe, who was one of the Nobel laureates, Felix Bloch, chemistry Nobel winner Max Born, Albert Einstein, okay, and so about 50 Erwin Schrödinger, so huge number of people, were left Germany, and that was one of the reasons why the Germans were lagging behind. Okay, and then subsequently a more solid effort was carried out, and this was the formation of something called as the Briggs Committee. Now, Briggs was a scientist, not as well known as others, but he was a administrator for the National Bureau of Standards. So he was made the head of the later committee, and again, but his committee was rather slow in acting. So it took the British to push the Americans to get the ball rolling, so to speak. And an Australian scientist named Oliphant, he visited United States and met head of the MIT, whose name is Vannevar Bush, and they decided to get the project on further rolling, and that led to the establishment that the whole project from the universities was transferred to the military, and later on, to the led to the start of the Manhattan Project. Okay, and again, so and as I mentioned earlier, that the Brits obviously had the talent, but they did not have enough resources to work with. And later on, the groundwork which was formed by this is so-called S1 committee that was formed, and this looks like the who is who of science. Okay, and that included Ernest Lawrence, as whom you recall, he was the West Coast talent and the Nobel winner from 1930s with the development of cyclotron and creating artificial elements, and not to mention Urey. Okay, and Urey was one of the scientists who will figure much more in discovery of hydrogen bomb, because he discovered the heavier isotope of hydrogen called deuterium, which has the proton and neutron combined. So he had received Nobel Prize for that as early as 1934. And obviously our friend John talked a lot about when he talked about on his class on DNA, because later on James Urey is the same Urey who did the experiment of creating life in chemistry laboratory in the famous Urey-Miller experiment, but that is much later, and again we are digressing. And not to mention, at James Conant, who was a chemist par excellence. He served in the First World War, and then later on for about 20 years, he was the president of Harvard, and so he was part of the committee. And this was an interesting discovery that I just came across just yesterday. This was interesting that during the First World War, as you may recall, that the mustard gas, and the Germans were maligned, and rightly so, for using mustard gas during war effort for the first time, in First World War. But the Americans were not too far behind, because U.S. had their own effort of creating poison gas, and that poison gas work was done by none other than Compton before he became head of Harvard, and that chemical was called lucite, and that was even considered, say, okay, well, Germans have their mustard gas and chlorine, but we have even a better gas, which will, none of the mask and other stuff will work against lucite. And that plant was established somewhere in Ohio, and it was all hush hush, so to speak. So it's interesting that, again, that is the like so-called the pot carrying the kettle black. So U.S. was doing their own share about chemical and bio or warfare. Okay, and we talked a little bit about the biological warfare when we talked about in the class that I did for microbes. So again, so this was like a who is who of committee of for the nuclear weapons, and with the age of secrecy, that this was supposed to be kept very secret, but as early as 1940, as you can see, this was earlier, front page article in New York Times, by a reporter who will figure large in when we talk about the actual drop on Hiroshima. And there was an article about isolating uranium, nuclear power. He coined the term atomic age. And obviously, he was a well-respected reporter. And this article, obviously, was read with enthusiasm all over the world. So this so-called secret did not stay secret for too long, because obviously the information could not become bottled up, type of thing. So, and and again, so we can talk a lot about his biography type of thing. And he was a immigrant from somewhere from former Russian Empire in Lithuania, and he changed his name because taking William from William Shakespeare and Lawrence after a street had lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And obviously, so that was so it was one of the immigrants who was a well-respected reporter for the NY Times. Okay, all right. I shall take a catch of breath instead of talking up at blitzkrieg speed, and ask if anybody has any comments or questions. All right. Okay. Please jump in if you have anything to add or. Okay. Now, moving on to the other side of the enemy side, the atomic research in Nazi Germany, that has always been a great mystery. And as before we got started, I mentioned that this is some of the book that I may have mentioned last week called Fallout, that after that goes into a lot more details by an English historian about how limited the German effort was. And obviously they had the theoretical knowledge and enough chemistry industry starting from way back, good access to uranium, and also the access to, but they had made some serious mistakes in the beginning. And one of the mistakes is, just to digress, we all need a bit of a humor during the talk, and this was a similar, because remember we just talked a couple of minutes ago about they lost all the scientists.
Now, I was once on a German talk show, and if you want to go on one, it's a lot of fun. It's really fun. And I was on this German talk show, and this woman said to me, she said, "Mr. Williams, why do you think there's not so much comedy in Germany?" And I said, "Did you ever think you killed all the funny people?"
And now, obviously, they didn't kill all the scientists, but they kicked them out for one reason or another. So that just the same thing that what Robin Williams said about the stand-up comics applies to the scientists as well. I think I just thought I just recalled that was a very appropriate analogy, so to speak. Okay, and the varieties of reason, because, and this was an interesting piece of trivia as to how personal, peccadillos can come to haunt, because one of the German scientists, his name was also Beth, that he was about in his late 40s, and he was infatuated with a woman who was about 20 years younger than him, and he was given the assignment of researching the moderator for the uranium, obviously, and he was so enamored with his personal affections that he miscalculated the he did not check the graphite for purity, And so it said, okay, well, graphite is not going to work as a moderator for the uranium. And that may have contributed to some extent for Germans abandoning the use of graphites as, and it took, set back their effort for a while. And they put a lot more faith on heavy water, which, and that's an interesting story that some of you may have seen in the movies. So that was one of the reasons why, and then again, we'll talk more about when we talk about the superstar of German effort, Werner Heisenberg. Now, the Brits had a big resource, that a guy named Paul Rosebud, and he was a physicist by training, but at the same time, he was not, didn't work in the lab, but he had a very powerful position for working for the scientific press, Springer Verlag, who is the giant scientific publishers in Europe, and he was the editor. So he had access to all the articles that were submitted to various in multiple languages. So, and during First World War, he served in the First World War, and at that time he had become a strong Anglophile. So even though he was German national, he was absolutely, admired the British so-called fairness, because he was a prisoner of war and he was treated very well by the British soldiers. So he was willing to share all the information with the Brits. So they had, and so he spied for Britain, and he obviously was well liked, and was in contact with who is who of the German and European establishment. And so the Brits had a very, and he also worked with metallurgy, which fit right in with the German effort. So being a publisher didn't hurt. Okay, and obviously, he was well off type of thing. So, and he was able to travel from Denmark to Sweden and France, and he was instrumental in helping Lisa Meitner escape Germany, type of thing. So he was one of the key linchpin that the Brits had as an asset, as it is called in the spy world. And also he gave a lot of information on the later on the scourge of the Battle of Britain, the V2 rockets. And again, so this is one of those things that nobody has any real handle as to how much the Germans were. And where we talked a minute ago about Werner Heisenberg, who is their superstar, the great theoretical physicist who had won the Nobel Prize at age 31 on quantum physics and matrix mechanics, so to speak. And then he was, again, even in the middle of the war, Denmark, he was able to travel and meet Niels Bohr before the Germans invaded. And again, at that time, he is supposed to have shown Niels Bohr a diagram, whether it was actually for the bomb or it was working on reactor. And that boils down to who knew what and what was told. And so that's as one of those mysteries that the historians have spent years looking through this. Okay. And again, at the same time, that on the Allies side, there was an information blackout with the chain reaction. As you may recall, I may have mentioned that Leo Szilard was rightly so very suspicious. So he made all the attempts to hide the publication of various articles. And turns out that this inspired the Russians to say, okay, all of a sudden there is a complete information blackout. So the Russian scientist that we mentioned earlier, he was saying, well, the West must be developing a strong effort, must be going on, type of thing. And that, again, gave a head start to the Russian effort. Okay, so, and at the same time, the Germans had a big disadvantage that they did not have adequate access to the big science that we talked about that the West Coast had of cyclotron, that the only cyclotron that they had was the one that the Curies had. And after the invasion of France, they were able to work on it for a little while. And so again, so their effort was not as serious as the West thought. And that is the big point that Peter Watson makes, that all the information was there, but if you may recall, it's like one of the Sean Connery movies called Anderson Tapes. None of this information was put together. Or similarly for 9/11, we kind of they decide that, well, all the information was scattered, but never put together. So the same analogy applies to some extent to finding out what the Germans were actually up to. Now, again, this was again an important point to emphasize, that the three red line highlights that the FDR had was advisory committee on uranium was started in the early 40s, pilot project for uranium just before the Pearl Harbor. Okay, and so put it on a stronger footing. And last but not the least, full-scale effort to bring the U.S. and so the various committees finally got into action, and it led to the big science that we talked about. And this was labeled Manhattan Project, and we talked about in the introduction that the three things that most Americans would recognize: Los Alamos and Oppenheimer and Hiroshima, of course. And obviously, there's a big story as to that the head of the Los Alamos project was Robert Oppenheimer, which several biographies have been written for him in the recent past. He was a colorful character. And just like Albert Einstein was famous, at that time, Oppenheimer was so famous that his famous pork pie hat was enough to recognize that, yes, we're talking about Oppenheimer. Okay. And we talked about, in the introduction of the class, I mentioned about the rise of the big science and so-called military-industrial complex. And so much so that the research and development budget for the government from $36 million in 1941 to as much as $500 million per year in 1945, and quickly rising to as much as $625 million by 1947. And so it's a variety of, so it was when the US jumped in, it jumped in a big way. And this was an interesting as to why it was called Manhattan Project. Okay, and this was, it got finally when it got started, because the federal building was the corner of Broadway and Chambers in Manhattan, New York. And that was was called the Laboratory for Development of Substitute Materials. Okay, so, and because to keep it secret, and people who are working at that time, and this is, again, I think, I don't know about most of you, but sometimes, like a lot of senior citizens, we were at Jeopardy, and just a few days ago, this was a clue as to why it was called Manhattan Project. And the answer was because Columbia was working on it, but the answer was actually because of this, that the location. And so it didn't have all, 18th floor was occupied by the Army Corps of Engineers. That's one of the reasons why the location was given. And the headquarters later on moved to Oak Ridge, which was, where there's a lot to talk about Oak Ridge later on. Okay, now this is a big video, and I don't know if let's see how we are doing on time. I think just for sake of time, maybe I'll just play it for a type of thing, so it will I can rest my voice.
The bomb had its roots in many places, all of them managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In this building, on Broadway in New York City, the engineers set up an office. On the 18th floor, the largest government scientific project in history begins to take shape. To keep its real purpose secret, the project is named after the engineer district where it's located, Manhattan. Ultimately, over 500,000 people will contribute to the Manhattan Project. They'll be led by this man, Leslie Richard Groves, Army engineer. Groves has been in charge of building the Pentagon and internment camps for Japanese Americans. Now he's itching for the next step in his career, an overseas combat assignment. Then Groves gets a surprise update from his boss.
I have a project for you. And Groves realizes what it is. Oh, no, not that thing. No. He's ready to go overseas, and he's very disappointed.
Developing an imaginary bomb based on invisible particles that will probably never work seems like a career dead end.
But, hey, you do what you're told. You do what you're told, and you do it to the best of your ability. And he put his foot on the accelerator and never let up.
But first, he negotiates a raise.
He says, I'm going to have to be a general. I mean, these scientists aren't going to respect me if I'm just a colonel.
Now he gets to work. Friday, day 1, purchase 1,200 tons of uranium ore. Saturday, negotiate special top priority rating for the project. Monday, meet with presidential science advisor Vannevar Bush. Wednesday, go to Tennessee. Buy 56,000 acres of land for factories. Next, visit universities and meet scientists. Columbia, Harold Urey. University of Chicago, Arthur Compton. Berkeley, California, Ernest Lawrence. Back to Washington. Groves has put in motion what will become a vast industrial complex in less than 2 months. There's only one thing missing, the bomb itself. It'll be years before there's nuclear fuel ready.
Okay, so I think we'll move right along because it's a long video type of thing. So I think it's almost like a 40 minutes long video, and I shall, the link is there on the slide itself, and I'll send it out separately as well. Okay, so, and the reason why he selected Oppenheimer, who was a theoretical physicist, to say the least, he'd never, except when he'd never even run a staff meeting to say, and he was obviously much more diversified, as I mentioned last week, and he was probably the worst choice that one could select. And the reason why Groves selected him, because he didn't understand anything about the atomic physics. I said, okay, so he went to this various scientists, said, please explain this to me. Okay, and all of them were just totally filled with jargon. Oppenheimer explained it in a very succinct and clear-cut way. That was one of the reasons why Groves selected, so, okay, he's our man. And he was warned that, yes, he perhaps had some communist sympathies, ties, his wife is communist, his brother has been part of the Communist Party in San Francisco, but again, Groves, so somehow he had a gut instinct and got selected for this thing. And I just thought this was.
It will cost $1 billion, 10 billion bucks will give. It will take 5,000 scholars, 7 years to make it live. All the generals approve it, all the money's now at hand. And go ahead, advance our program, teaching students now we bend. We have charter transportation, we'll provide a weekly dance. Our motto's integration, there is nothing left to chance. This machine is just a model for a big, it will go, it will.
This was a song by Tom Lehrer, who is well known for various, he was a mathematician by training, and I'm sure his song about periodic table is just absolutely a delight. And obviously I think if your children learn the new math, he has a song about new math. This was a song about the atomic project. Now, a word or two about Oppenheimer, that he was from a very wealthy Jewish family on East Coast and graduated rather early, went to Cambridge, got his PhD in astrophysics, and then was appointed as the head. And he was obviously, well versed in many things, including literature, foreign languages, including the archaic original language of Sanskrit of India. And and he was selected, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, type of thing, that and in spite of his communist ties. Okay, and again, it was interesting to hear as to how these people who are very pacifist and laid back, that so much so that the war changed, that during the war, while there was still the atom bomb was still further away, these people were afraid that the Germans may develop so-called dirty bomb. So they were thinking about poisoning the food supply of Germany with radioactive strontium and killing, hundreds of thousands of people, as to how people who were scientists and laid back were obviously, were not opposed to using poisoning food supply of Western Europe type thing. So obviously they didn't get around to doing it. And now he had problem with depression, and on his own he had gone to the ranch on the West Coast and to New Mexico. So he was familiar with the area. So when Groves was looking for a secret laboratory, and this was just absolutely the right place that they came up with. And so that was one of the reasons how Los Alamos got selected, type of thing. And for those of you who want to know more about him, there's a well researched biography by a guy named Ray Monk, which I read as part of the studies. And again, and this is one trivia that just almost blew me out of my mind, that he was initially interested in geology, that at age 12, he had sent a paper to New York Geological Society, and they did not know that he was just a 12-year-old. And his paper was accepted and he presented the paper at the society meeting in New York. Okay, and obviously was well respected type of thing. So it was then, and so this was, and again, when he traveled to Europe, he had worked at various institutes, including Göttingen, and then subsequently was offered position at Harvard, but for whatever personal reasons, he selected to have a dual position at Caltech and Berkeley, and again was a brilliant teacher at that time, and again he nourished a lot of good postdocs. A lot of Nobel laureates were taught by Oppenheimer, and as I mentioned when we talked about Ernest Lawrence, that they totally antithesis of two people with totally different personalities became close friends and worked together. And again, and the big power was that he was able to persuade a lot of the scientists without telling what actually they were going to be working on, the type of thing, to come to this remote place in Los Alamos. And so he had enough persuading power that he was able to recruit a top-notch team of a huge number of people. Okay, and again, I think we can talk a lot about, and this was Oppenheimer's, legend that where left-wing politics he was involved in. He was sympathetic, he was not directly involved, and his wife Kitty was member of the Communist Party on the West Coast, and he was, again, there was a huge objection from Herbert Hoover, the head of FBI. Okay, and they, as I mentioned, that we will try to see as to how many women, and one of the women that was actually recruited was a lesser-known figure named Dr. Lily Horning. Okay, she was a Czechoslovakian chemist. She was married to a equally reputable scientist named Donald Hornig, who later on goes on to become president of Brown University, and she had worked at Bryn Mawr. And when she wanted to work in the project, she moved to Los Alamos along with her husband. And the big question was, can you type? And obviously, that was her response, was that she had masters in chemistry, And later on, she was allowed to work as a chemist. So it was one of the few scientists again. And later on, she went on to complete her PhD and did a lot of work for women in science. And okay. And again, so at that time, there were no ladies' restroom at Harvard even after war when she came to. And again, Harvard integrated much later, as most of you may know, because most of their sister institution was Radcliffe. And again, we talked about why Los Alamos. It was originally a boys' ranch, and that was because of isolated area location, it was selected. And it grew from 250 people in 1943 to as many as 2,500 by 1945. Okay, and again, this is just again rehashes the things and the cost was, close to $2 billion. But considering how much the United States was spending for the regular war, this was a good bargain, so to speak. It even for 1942 sums, it seems like a large number. But at the same time, they were spending millions per day for the war effort. So overall, it was an investment that paid off handsomely, so to speak. And again, it grew exponentially along with various facilities that we'll get into. Now, at the same time, people were petrified as to what the Germans were up to. And so General Groves, had established an operation called Operation Alsos, and which is a very colorful story that I mentioned earlier. And so much so that I mentioned earlier that a well-known popular science writer named Sam Kean has written a book which just came out in 2019. It's titled The Bastard Brigade, the true story of the renegade scientists and spies who sabotaged the Nazi atomic bomb. It's a good, like a sort of cloak and dagger story with some colorful characters, to put it mildly. And this was created as early as 1943, when the U.S. bomb was still in infancy, and involved all sorts of odd characters who are sort of misfits, and which we'll talk about in a little bit better. And they continued very vigorously after the surrender of Germany, and varieties of, and the name, that this just blows your mind, that the name Alsos was Greek for Groves. So obviously Groves was petrified as to how the name was selected. Okay, obviously our Greek colleague is not here, so, but that's all. Take the word from Wikipedia, then this was one of the words. And the two people who will figure large was a German Jewish scientist named Samuel Goudschmidt. Is spelled Goudschmidt, but it's pronounced Goudschmidt. And he was professor at the University of Michigan, and after surrender of Germany, he was given the assignment to see what the Germans were up to actually. And another colorful character was a Ukrainian First World War veteran named Boris Pash. His name was actually Russian Pashosky or something like that. And he was a colonel in the army, and he was given the assignment to lead the Operation Alsos in Western Europe. And so, and they succeeded to a considerable extent, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes, and with some successes and some failures. And after the collapse of Germany, they were able to arrest some of it was almost like a wild chase as to where these people are hiding out, including none other than Heisenberg, who was the theoretical head of the German effort, and Otto Hahn, who worked on the chemist par excellence, who worked on chain reaction, and misspoke, fission. And so various peoples were captured, and including various uranium ores, which were hiding in caves. They were able to locate it and capture several tons of uranium that was captured. And after that, the conclusion at the end of the day was that the German effort was ludicrously on a small scale, and there were some laboratories, and at the most, and they hardly had any cyclotron that was sort of laughable compared to the American effort. That was the conclusion of physicist Sam Gaudsmit. Okay. And again, so that, so this was rumors or reality type of thing. And so, again, the pre-war effort versus the realities were totally different type of thing, as I've already alluded to, type of thing as to how they were able to capture the cyclotron that was under the control of the Curies, Irene and Joliet Curies. Now, and this gets to be more interesting, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that the Germans had put all their faith on using heavy water and the biggest heavy water plant, or that the deuterium isotope, which is the heavy water from hydroelectric facility, because the people who were rich in hydroelectric sources were the Norwegians, and the Nork's hydro facility was in production from as early as 1934. And after the capture of Norway, the Nazis had, the stronghold of it, and they were interested in buying it up. But the Norwegian sympathies lied with the West. So again, to their credit, the French were able to go, and the French bankers were able to go and buy up a lot of the heavy water stocks that were there, and secretly were able to send it to Britain. So, and that gave a head start to the British effort on research at the same time. So this was interesting cloak and dagger stuff about the destroying the German efforts at procuring the heavy water plants. And varieties of efforts were carried out, some with variable success by the Brits and later on by the Americans. And again, they were given fancy names of Operation Gunnerside and Operation Grouse, of destroying. And some of the raids were successful, or they were thought to be successful, to say, but only to the chagrin of the Brits. The Germans were able to get the heavy water cells. It was, just to give you the basic science, heavy water is separated by electrolysis process, but the Germans were able to rebuild very quickly, after the attempts by the sabotage by the British establishment. Again, so the efforts to destroy it were worthwhile, but not horrendously successful. And Hollywood had made it, and the most successful effort was when the Germans were transporting a huge amount of heavy water by a ferry across a lake, and some of the Norwegian saboteurs were able to swim underneath and were able to attach explosive devices in the middle of the lake through which this ferry transported. Because after the initial air raids, the Germans had extra security and anti-aircraft guns. So this was their only chance, and they were able to successfully sabotage the ferry and sink it to the bottom of the lake. And so a huge amount of heavy water was kept out of the hands of the Germans. Okay, all right. And this is an interesting character, okay, named Mo Berg. Mo Berg was a Jewish kid from New York City who, much to the chagrin of his father, did not decide to become a lawyer, but become a professional baseball player. And he went to Princeton and was really a brilliant person. He was fluent in various languages, and was a lawyer too. So one of the few baseball players who was a professional baseball player, but was also a lawyer. Okay, and was recruited, and later on studied at Sorbonne in 1926. Played in minor leagues and various professional teams, in United States, and was later on was recruited by the predecessor of CIA called OSA, and was given, and again, it was a colorful character, to put it mildly. He was a news junkie, and during the baseball career, he was also on one of the NBC shows, which is like a quiz show called Information Please, and later on, and volunteered for the Army and was assigned to the to the OSA because of his knowledge about languages and versatility and multiple talents, was given the assignment to spy on Germany. And now, obviously, he did not know much physics, but was actually taught rudimentary physics so he could talk to the German scientists and try to see what they were exactly up to. And to his credit, he was able to pick up enough physics to at least sort of BS his way into talking to various scientists. And they had information from various sources that Heisenberg was going to give a lecture in Switzerland. And he had managed to pose as a graduate student and attend the meeting in Zurich, with the idea that obviously, and he was given a pistol as well as a cyanide tablet. Okay, so if it's appeared that Heisenberg was actually close to developing bomb, he was advised to shoot Heisenberg. Initial plans to kidnap Heisenberg were actually dropped because that would be a heavy price to pay for violating Switzerland neutrality. And so they thought the better part would be to assassinate him. And at the same time, if Moberg was captured, then he should, instead of revealing information, he should kill himself by taking cyanide. But turns out that after listening to Heisenberg, who just mostly talked about the theoretical aspect, Moberg, to his luck and Heisenberg's lecture, decided that, well, it wasn't worthwhile after all killing Heisenberg. And so that's an interesting chapter that Sam Keen mentions in Bastard Brigade. And it was absolutely delightful to hear as to, and then subsequently he, now again, like a lot of spies, like James Bond, he was given carte blanche to spend the government money, and he had a high lifestyle. So even after getting out of OSA, he did some work in South America and lived a rather, well-cushioned life instead of eating KP rations. Okay, now as mentioned earlier, type of thing that Heisenberg was able to travel to neutral Denmark earlier and meet the giant of quantum physics, Niels Bohr. And during the meeting, Heisenberg was thought to have shown a letter which was, exactly, the letter is lost to posterity, but during this, as to, and that letter spooked Bohr. And when later on, after the Germans invaded Denmark, Bohr was able to escape to Britain, and then later on traveled to America. And at that time, Bohr was older and was not quite up to the state of the art, and perhaps he didn't understand what Heisenberg and other people were up to, and that led to more frightening interpretation in the United States and in Britain, that the Germans were really very close to developing things. And this was placed into an opera by a well-known producer named Michael Frayn. And this was an opera called Copenhagen. That was a play performed in London in 1998, later came to Broadway and had varieties of performances, and was very popular amongst various scientists. Okay. Okay, about that action. I don't know which. Jay had a comment in the chat room about. Sorry, I just saw it, so I don't know exactly which one he was referring to, but perhaps the same one. So, and so the question that is still not answered to real historian satisfaction: did Heisenberg actually, was he close to developing the bomb? Did he lie after the war and said, well, that he really sabotaged the bomb? Was he have enough technical knowledge, type of thing? So it's interesting as to how, so that answer will never come to truth as to, so, and so that's a piece of, so who knew what and when, that still remains a mystery as to. They did have reactor, they knew a little bit about plutonium. Bohr was not aware about this thing. Well, the German scientists actually were anti-Nazi as to did the Germans know? And at the same time, they were running out of money, and obviously the Nazi establishment was, they wanted quick results. And when the scientists told the Nazi who in who that it's going to take about 5 years or longer, they finally said, okay, well, enough is enough. So Albert Speer, who was probably the sanest and the most logical amongst the Nazi establishment, well, had said, what, put a stop to the effort. And again, we talked earlier, and I'm repeating myself, that the Brits were aware of it, but again, and the US did not trust the Brits. Okay, and the two big people who were in power, that James Conant and Vannevar Bush, they had persuaded the US establishment to go alone, and decided, okay, well, they would use some British knowledge, but they decided to go on their own, basically, type of thing. And as I mentioned earlier, the Russians were not totally in the dark, but were strongly underestimated. Okay, and okay, and we talked about Heisenberg enough, type of thing, that, and he maintained till the end that the German physicists were trying to avoid making the bomb. But the truth comes out when they were interned at something called the Farm post-war in Britain, including Heisenberg and Hahn. And when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, they were totally in disbelief that there is no way that the Allies could have done it, because, obviously they had a chip on their shoulder. They thought that only the German scientists were smart, and there is no way that but they were absolutely flabbergasted, to put it mildly, that the Allies were able to develop and drop a working weapon. Okay, so, and obviously, and their conversation were recorded by the Brits when they were interned post-war in a place called the Farm in UK. Okay.
Early in the war, Allied intelligence had disclosed that Germany was increasing production of heavy water in the famous Norwegian hydroelectric plants at Ryukon and Vemork. These plants also produce.
Bharat, the volume is very low. Maybe you can raise the volume.
Let's see if I can. Okay, all right. Let's see. I think I may have to minimize this. Okay, I think I'm. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this for the time, because I'm going to be, I may have to stop this screen share and mess with this, type of thing. This is, the link is, I'll just send it out, because again, as I mentioned earlier, these are long windows, and we're barely halfway through the slides that I have internet to this. So again, this talks about the atomic raids that took place, on Norway, basically. And it's one of those corny videos of British Pathé, I think, so it's okay. And, and so we talked about the Kurt, mispronouncing the name, Haukelid. It's a Norwegian name, and he succeeded in destroying the heavy water ferry and obviously, they were not averse to loss of passengers. The explosive with alarm clock, were sabotaged to the ferry in the middle of the lake. And okay. Now, at the same time, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that Leo Szilard, and when the chain reaction and other stuff was published, they wanted to keep it secret, but the French, to the chagrin of United States and Britain, they insisted on publishing type of thing. And okay, so it was an interesting thing that they chose to publish the research, and obviously, and give a head start to the Russians and the Norwegians. Okay, I think this one is, I'm going to skip this one. So I think this is, talks about the nuclear reactor type of thing. So, and again, let's just go over the chain reaction concept once again.
One neutron can cause the release of 2 to 3 neutrons, and if those 2 to 3 can each cause the release of another 2 to 3, then it was possible that what was called a chain reaction could occur. Since these reactions would occur in a tiny fraction of a second, and since each fission also released significant amounts of energy, this led further to the possibilities of nuclear weapons. One neutron.
Okay. Okay, so now this is the big event that took place, and
becomes established. They come to the University of Chicago and they begin to build the pile under Stagg Field. There was a squash court. It was a heady environment. You had the world's best physicists about to unleash nuclear power. They're also thinking about the implications of what it will mean being used for the destruction of humanity and not for peaceful purposes. The pace was fast. They were working against the Germans. They literally believed it was hour by hour, day by day. They might be behind.
They didn't work 40-hour weeks. They worked 2 12-hour shifts every day. This was going on 24/7 for 2 weeks. They understood what was at stake. They understood that civilization, the Western world, was at stake. The first step was to acquire the materials.
Fermi begins to understand that if they build a reactor with very pure graphite, they will get the reaction that they're looking for.
The amount was huge, 45,000 bricks, each brick weighing almost 20 pounds.
They're stacking these graphite blocks that are incredibly heavy. They got day laborers who are helping them with it. They were using uranium.
Uranium came in 2 forms, one metallic uranium and the other uranium oxide.
This was the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of science that was happening here.
What is really quite amazing is the short duration during which the pile was actually assembled.
It was a matter of days where they built that reactor.
15 days specifically.
The group felt the weight of the country, if not the world, on their shoulders.
The politicians, FDR included, really did not understand the nature of the beast that they were funding.
Those in the room understood that they were on the cusp of a revolutionary change in energy.
They had just finished building Chicago Pile 1 the day before, literally December 1st, 1942, and Enrico Fermi declared next morning they would
that
start
sort of
actual
stuff. I'm not completely done.
On December 2nd, 1942, Fermi and his team were able to control and sustain a nuclear chain reaction.
Because since I know it's...
It would not be too much to say this is almost as important as the discovery of fire.
It actually wasn't clear what it meant. They didn't know if they'd be able to weaponize it. And they didn't know if the Germans had already weaponized it. But the fact that they could control the chain reaction meant it was possible.
Arthur Holly Compton really drove it as the lead scientist. He didn't do it alone. He did it with dozens and dozens of scientists, and they built, as Einstein would say, on the shoulders of giants. It was really, in many ways, the first time big science was done.
And these big efforts are both exciting and dangerous. They have enormous implications for good and for evil. And it's really up to us to figure out how to manage the risks so that we can reap the benefits.
Okay, so this is, that in University of Chicago, and the Fermi is around Chicago. There are at least half a dozen things that are labeled after Enrico Fermi, including the famous Fermi Lab. And as much as 45,000 pure graphite blocks were used, and they weighed as much as 360 tons, and the uranium was, 5 to 6 tons. And again, I don't think the president of the University of Chicago was told that they were doing this. Okay, and this was done under the military, and they used cadmium as neutron absorber. And again, this was amazingly cool experimental genius by Enrico Fermi. And so much so that, and they were not sure exactly whether they were able to stop the reaction when they wanted to, because they had to pull out the rods from the graphite, basically. And they gave the job to the youngest scientists, and so much so that they had one person standing with an axe to absolutely stop the reaction. Okay, and his job was to, if they're not able to control it, his job was to cut the cord, so to speak. And finally, they had a big Enrico Fermi Italian. They had a bottle of Chianti to celebrate the success, and obviously that Chianti was celebrated and was the somewhere along the line photographed. And finally, they had sent a telegram as to Compton: the Italian navigator has landed in New World. James Conant's reply was, "How are the natives? Very friendly." So this was actually finally the start of the things. And obviously, their calculations were done with, as most of you recognize, the slide rule.
Becomes a step.
Okay, and this is again Enrico Fermi, and who I think died a few years later of cancer, and he was the architect, of the Beta Decay, which we talked about earlier, that he had missed some of the things, but again had proposed, and subsequently had migrated from Columbia to Chicago, where he did most of the work, and then again was pioneer at Oak Ridge and this is just to give an example as to make the chemistry rather simple. The uranium ore, and then the word that is used called yellow cake, which is transported in uranium fluoride, which is the gaseous material that is used for enrichment, and nuclear fuel, which is compact, inert, insoluble. So this is just basic 101. And to the credit, after the war, the scientists did release a general information for the public. It was called the Los Alamos Primer, and this book is available. You can just download it on YouTube as a PDF from as a project, and it gives the basic information, so to speak, as to gives you like a script for designing the nuclear weapons. But obviously, it's not as simple as it's thought. Now, I think we're coming up to past 11 o'clock. We ought to take a few minutes break so I can rest my voice and people can take a bathroom stop. So I think I will pause here for 5 minutes. Sorry for running over time by a few minutes, but I think we probably should take a break. I apologize for not stopping at 11 precise. Okay. All right. Meet again in about 5 minutes, if I may. Didn't see eye to eye, or the Brits and the French for that matter. There's still the information was so shared, and they were all well versed in various languages, so they were able to read the articles. So the information sharing, and obviously the later on, and I think the tongue-in-cheek, the Hungarian genius that took place, and the migration, the huge migration that talked about with the Jewish scientists to the United States, that gave a kickstart to the U.S. type of thing. And to me, it just blows my mind as to how with basic equipment that the Brits were able to do research. For example, I showed the slide of Paul Mosley. He just used silk strings and a little toy train, so to speak, to say, okay, do the experiment of various elements. It's just like a few pounds worth of equipment, and they were able to do some pioneering research in fundamental physics. So I was just, it's just like somebody mentioned earlier, standing on the giants of shoulders. If we count, there are about like half a dozen number of people who actually did the pioneering things. Like obviously, everybody is aware of Einstein's, the thought experiments which violated the traditional physics and Newtonian physics and upset the apple cart completely. So it was just amazing as to how the few people, like, to name just like, like Niels Bohr, Rutherford, and Einstein, you could just give you three names, and those three people, just give kickstart to the whole physics world. Along with, and the Germans were always great on the chemistry, the chemistry, because the Brits looked down upon chemists because you're a gentleman, you don't want to get your fingers dirty. It's okay to wear long university robes and look for rocks, but they were far later in chemistry later on.
Well, what was their incentive for this research? I mean, was it basically just academic, or was it
absolutely
applied to
they looked out upon money making? Yeah, absolutely. It was just, they didn't want to, I mean, it was just search for the knowledge for the sake of knowledge. A lot of it was just,
Is that kind of unusual today?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because you look at a lot of the postdocs. I mean, I'm just no, because and that's obviously the impetus now is on biology. The same this thing is done for molecular. I mean, John, who is a real scientist, he can comment. I think that still is, obviously, we before you joined, I think before 10 o'clock we were talking about how the recent incentive is okay. Everybody wants to monetize their discoveries, and just form a startup company. So the things have changed to one extent after 1980s, but still, there are people. I mean, it's just amazing how many years. I'm just reading right now a Code Breaker, the story of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Carpentier. So I'm almost 2/3 done with the book, and a lot of postdocs and other people. It's like these people just worked on bacteria. I'm just curious. So they worked for like 5-7 years as a postdoc. So it's a fascinating thing as to how the field has shifted to biology now. What was there for physics, because it's like and a lot of times when I listen a lot of time to lectures, so there's like a crisis in physics, that they spent billions of dollars building the CERN super collider, and they've just discovered one Higgs particle. So it's kind of they're sort of at they've peaked, and so I think so a lot of people are just switching to biology and neuroscience, so to speak. So that's the okay. So I think enough for this thing. And no, it's really amazing as to how some people have it's like I don't know if some of you may know about Edward O. Wilson. I mean, he's the giant of biology and society. I mean, he has spent like 37 years studying ants, so I mean, that's just, and I mean, he's been bitten enough time by ants, but still, and he's at 80, he's still like the, big person of sociobiology at Harvard. Okay, I think we should get started for the sake of time. We're reasonably on time, because there was the advantage of skipping some of the videos, and I shall send out the link there. Okay, so we can start recording and we'll continue. So this is the Los Alamos Palmer, and we talked about the, and a lot of the lectures were given, and the lectures by Oppenheimer were given to new arrivals type of thing, and some of these things were available. And according to this thing, some of these this information that was in public domain has been taken down after 9/11. But somehow I think I was able to find some of the stuff, so some of the information, and this is just the people of the scientists, people who worked at the Chicago pile, as they called it, the reactor scientists were gathered after the experiment. Enrico Fermi, who is right here in front, like this is Fermi, okay. And Leo Szilard, the man who came up with the idea, that's him right here. Okay. And the woman in the picture is Leona Woods. Okay, this was, as you saw, that there was only one woman in this picture. Okay, right here. And that is a woman named Leona Woods. And she was brought in to construct the boron trifluoride neutron counter, which were put in the middle to slow down the movement of the neutrons inside the graphites and uranium stacks. And so she worked on, and so she was one of the few women was designing as a neutron chopper. And so, right, and then later on, she worked at Hansford in Washington State, which was the big reactors and was still going strong. So that's the story, I think. And this is just a cartoon about Leona Woods, which is, you tried the rest, now try fluoride. So this was, she worked on Chicago, and so this was identification, so it's one of the cartoons, so that was, Leona Marshall Libby. And she married another well-known scientist named Marshall Libby later on. And Libby on his own has, I think, done work on ozone. Okay, but that's, again, we are digressing type of thing. So he's well-known scientist in his own right type of thing. So, and the varieties of isotope techniques that were also worked, that for carbon dating, so that is Libby's contribution to science. Okay. All right, so we have, now this is enough. I think this is again a rehash of the same thing. And these are the various locations that all of you, would be aware of to a major extent. And we've talked about the Manhattan Project headquarters, Chicago. Oak Ridge we'll talk about a little bit more through Hansford, and last but not the least, Los Alamos, okay, and the Trinity site. So these are the various sites where the work took place. And again, this was, and the secrecy was paramount, the sign that the entrance, well-known sign at Oak Ridge, the city just appeared in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee. It was created in 1942. And again, by 1945, there were as many as 75,000 people were living in Oak Ridge. And it was so secretive, it did not appear on any of the maps. And again, this is, Atomic Town that's not on the map. It's an article from not a very reputable newspaper in UK, Daily Mail. And so this was what let it stay here. So, and obviously they were not talking about Las Vegas, they were talking about Oak Ridge. And Oak Ridge, again, the article appeared in Atlantic, and Army evicted several and took an area of about 90 square miles, located 20 miles west of Knoxville, to establish something called, obviously, Clinton Engineering Works, and various electromagnetic separation plants for enriching uranium, and various code names that the Army kept it for secrecy, called Y-12, were built there. And again, the lie detector test that was given, don't know how reliable that was, but, and so this was a remote area, and to enrich uranium-235. And they also got, and again, the Groves did not leave anything unchanged. He established various methods. There were several methods for uranium enrichment, and so he, not to leave anything chance, he established major projects for all three of them. And this is a well-known photograph of various women who were just from the surrounding areas. They were not told exactly what they were doing for, why they were doing. They were just supposed to keep the needle in the middle, so to speak. So that's all they were told. And to the scientists' surprise, obviously there was a lot of class distinction. The scientists looked down upon them, but they were actually better than various physicists. And they were focused, and they were much more precise in maintaining the magnets and the equipment in the right target level. Okay, and okay, and the various corporations were involved in gaseous extraction type of thing, and this were part of the Kellex Corporation. And now the corporation is now defunct and is part of the British Aeronautical Establishment Corporation. And there were several technical challenges for gaseous extraction for using uranium fluoride, and they needed various filters and workable gas pump, various pipes that were resistant to the corrosive action of uranium hexafluoride. And so this was a difficult task. Okay. And again, as much as they were trying to stay secret, when Niels Bohr from UK traveled to United States at the risk of being bombed, the ship that was transporting him obviously made a zigzag motion, and Niels Bohr and his son entered as celebrities scientists to United States. But the article just briefly appeared in New York Times. So much for secrecy in 1943, in the heyday of the effort. The refuged Danish scientists reached London from Sweden bearing plans to great importance to Allied war effort. Okay, so and obviously by that time, as we mentioned earlier, he and a mathematical physicist named John Wheeler had published various theoretical analyses of fission. And these are the various. Now again, one of the methods that was used was based on the Ernest Lawrence cyclotron, that various magnets and the so-called cauldrons were installed in Tennessee, and the amount that they were able to get was ridiculously small by the magnetic method of separation. As little as 10 grams was produced in one cauldron. So in order to get anything approachable to reasonable amount, they had as many as 1,100 cauldrons were instituted, and Lawrence was in charge, and he traveled from the West Coast to Tennessee quite often to supervise it in person. And again, these were some of the magnetic separation method that was used in Tennessee, because the gaseous method was too unreliable to rely on. Okay, but so they wanted to duplicate to make sure that no stones were left unturned. Okay, this was the gas diffusion plan. Okay, and again, it continued later on until 1986. Okay, so varieties of methods were used at the same time. Okay, just to get the point, type of thing. Okay, and again, now again, they wanted to use copper, but which was in short supply. So at that time, they decided to use silver instead. Now the only people who had the silver were the United States Treasury. So they had enough clout to requisition silver from the U.S. Treasury. At that time, this is absolutely delightful. The scientists were told that they required silver to conduct for the electrical conductivities of higher. Said how much silver they want. 15,000 tons. The Treasury people were astonished. The silver is measured in ounces, not in tons. The reply was, okay, then we want 5.4 times 10 to the power 8 ounces. But they did manage to get the silver. And this was the War Department eventually withdrew more than 400,000 billion bars, and they were transported from depository in New York as Fort Knox of silver to Oak Ridge, and was again eventually returned. So the U.S. Treasury, that was U.S. Treasury's contribution, along with the $2 billion that it cost. Okay, so I just thought that was rather hilarious. So the varieties of method that were used were centrifuges, okay, electromagnetic separation, and gaseous diffusion. Okay, so again, to re-emphasize the point, and now this is where our initial talk about isotope comes in useful, because the natural uranium is absolutely relatively low amount of uranium-235, and the rest of that is 238. So the varieties of techniques were required, and the enrichment process takes place. And obviously in the news that the Iranian enrichment, the centrifuges that we talked about, so the enrichment that is needed for reactors is far less than the so-called quote-unquote weapon-grade uraniums. So it requires, it required a massive effort, and the people who are involved, obviously Ernest Lawrence, who used the electromagnetic separation method, Oppenheimer, who was the head, and Glenn Seaborg, who made it easier by by discovering the artificial element plutonium. Okay, so And so again, so, and a word or two about the great Glenn Seaborg, okay? And this is the place where he worked with Gilman Hall at room 237 at UC Berkeley. And he's credited to have with the cyclotron, and he's credited to have discovered plutonium, which is in February of 1941. And at the UC Berkeley, and then he went on, he's almost like a giant of discovering elements. He's credited to have discovered not just plutonium, but various other elements: plutonium, americium, curium, berkelium, californium, einsteinium, fermium, mendelevium, and nobelium. Okay, element 106, while he was still living, was named in his honor Seaborgium. Okay, so, and he, not to be outdone, he also discovered as many as 100 isotopes of transuranium elements. And he was part of the Manhattan Project, extraction process, various atomic bomb, and he advised various presidents as a science advisor. So he was a giant of, atomic and physical chemistry, to put it mildly. And these are the various works at University of Chicago. Those are still, and again, at that time they were working on the earlier reactors, and DuPont Corporation was given the contract to work with. And again, the two tussles between the pure scientists and the engineers that took place, because the scientists, the DuPont scientists did not trust the DuPont engineers, didn't trust the scientists, and the vice versa. So it was just a little bit of a power struggle that went on between the two groups. Okay, and these are the various elements, okay, as to how they are related to and on the periodic table. Okay, and just, I think, let me see if I can zoom in. So this is the timeline that we were talking about. So as we talked earlier when we were during the break, we were talking about how we stand on the shoulders of giants, starting from Michael Faraday, the pioneer of electricity, to Röntgen, to Becquerel, to Marie Curie, to Thomson, who discovered electron, Rutherford, and the various names we talked about last time. Okay, and Rutherford, again, he discovered the nucleus. James Chadwick, the Curies, who discovered artificial radioactivity. Macmillan, who discovered, neptunium. Glenn Seaborg, who we just talked about. Enrico Fermi. So, and then last but not the least, the quarks that were proposed, which do not figure well into our discussion at this time. Okay, so that's sort of a timeline as to the varieties of giants of physics and chemistry who were involved. And one person who, again, we didn't mention too much was Emilio Sagri, who was the historian of a lot of the work that went on, and he's done, and his collections are absolutely useful when researching this subject matter. And again, he was one of the prodigies of Enrico Fermi, and he discovered the workhorse element technetium, which is used in medicine, and plutonium. Okay. Now, again, moving on from Oak Ridge that we talked briefly about was Hanford. Okay, Hanford. So they were looking for various places which were isolated. A lot of land was available, close to water for reactors for development of plutonium, because they would cool down. So a young engineer, Grove, had assigned, because there was very few, they were surveying the whole of Western and Central United States for suitable places. And a young engineer named Frank Matthias, who was only 34 years old, University of Wisconsin graduate, was assigned to, and so he discovered a place near Columbia River, which was sparsely populated and isolated, and that's where they decided to build the plutonium plant for enrichment from uranium. Okay, and this was one of the first reactors that took place in a place called Hanford in Western Washington. And the task after the initial research project at University of Chicago was given to DuPont. And again, for natural causes, DuPont charged only $1 for their work involvement in various electromagnetic process separation of enrichment that taken place at various reactors were built and at a rapid pace in Western Washington at Hansford. And at that time, a few Native Americans, a tribe named Wanapo, who lived there, and Frank Matthias had sympathy for them, so they were allowed to stay, but the rest of the family were evacuated. And again, at that time, due to the war effort in a hurry, they had very little regard for the pollution and what was happening to the water supply of Columbia River, and how to bury the radioactive waste. And those huge barrels were buried underneath this thing. And still, even until the present day, a huge effort is done by the federal government to clean up some of the nuclear pollutions that has taken place in this area. And at the end of the day, not just one, but 6 reactor sites were built, and they were labeled alphabetically B, D, and F, and along with the graphite, various tubes. And so it was a massive effort that was done on a gigantic scale in Hansford, Michigan, by the Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, and this was just to rehash some of the elements about plutonium was discovered and was made from uranium. So just for the chemistry buffs, by adding neutrons, neutron capture, and neptunium, which is less stable, and after radioactive decay, it generates into plutonium. And we showed earlier that a little slide of a made-for-TV movie. And again, so, and this was the part of the Nagasaki bomb that was used. It's quite toxic material, and it required,
Only one of them.
This last time, but just as a refresher, I'm showing it again. I'm not because it's an important thing
To publish our claim to the discovery of a new element.
But they realized that if this was a fissionable element, it was of military importance and there was a war going on.
Okay, I think so.
Rod, excuse me, Bill Sapper has a question.
Oh yeah, sure.
Bharat, it just kind of strikes me that there was a tremendous amount of material and human resources that were devoted to these efforts.
Oh yes.
Where was all this funding coming from?
Oh, this was it was like I mentioned earlier. It was the U.S. government. It was like they had written $500 million. Basically. So it was like so the total cost at the end became like $2 billion. So it was the biggest government project that was done. To put it, So absolutely, they had, the General Groves has carte blanche to buy this property, and so absolutely, he was, even now there were no restrictions type thing. And as I mentioned earlier, compared to the actual amount that was spent for the regular military, this was bargain. It turned out to be, type thing. So it was a huge amount of funding. There was, talk about, how when government made up its mind. So I guess almost, you could just like the warp effort for vaccination, as to how much money went to the Pfizer and Moderna and other companies, so to speak. So this was the same thing, type thing. So,
The only workable method in 1940.
You are not sharing your screen, Bharat.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In the
Something goofy. I'm sorry.
Now you're sharing.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's, it kicked me out actually. So yeah.
The only workable method in 1942 was electromagnetic separation. In this process, a mass spectrometer used for separating electrically charged particles according to their mass sent a stream of uranium atoms past a magnet. Atoms of the lighter isotope U-235
would be deflected more than those of the heavier U-238 and would be captured one atom at a time. Scientists at Columbia University championed a competing mode of separation, gaseous diffusion. This method passed the isotope through a porous barrier that separated the lighter isotope from its heavier counterpart, but it proved to be technically challenging.
In a square centimeter, about the size of a thumbnail, you've got to have hundreds of millions of pores, and they have to all be the same size. If they're too big, the gas flows through without any separation. If they're too small, the gas gets in there and it condenses on the surface, won't go through. So you talk about obstacles.
Okay, and let me go to okay, yeah, now it is. Yeah, so this is, again, we talked about some of the diffusion methods that, the thermal diffusion method. I already showed you this picture type of thing, and the controversy between, and the waste was a big problem type of thing, especially in Washington State type of thing. So, and the fight, especially at all these places, was between the scientists and the so-called hillbillies, type of thing. And finally, the tiniest amount of plutonium was produced, was gradually enriched, and was so important that initially it was transported, later with all sorts of armed guard from Hansford to Los Alamos. And later on, they switched to planes and transferred, because obviously there was a big rush that was going on. And a lot of the wastewater was stored in tanks, and as much as, several billions of gallons. And there have been higher incidents of cancer, and that has taken place. So, okay, now let's see. Most polluted area in the United States, buried in 56 million gallons of radioactive waste. Okay, and this is Hansford. There were as many as 177 waste tanks.
Oh.
I mean, the numbers are staggering, but obviously at that time, nobody had any clear-cut handle on it. Okay, and this was some of the methods that were done by, okay, but I think just, for the sake of time, this is almost too technical for most people's comfort. And this is a book that just came out by a chap who grew up in Hansford area. And obviously that's one of the reasons why I was interested, type thing, the Apocalypse Factory. And this just came out fairly recently. I think it's about that. If you're interested in the history of what went on out in the Northwest, this is a good read, well-written book type of thing. And I would recommend that for the history aficionados. And again, we talked at length about some of the same data. So, okay, and
35.
Okay, and this may be a repeat slide type thing. And the various moderators that were used were the two ones that were established again, repeating, the graphite, which was used, and the heavy water that used favored by the Germans. Okay, and so, and this is, again, just the idea of the so-called gun design that was used for the first bomb type of thing, the conventional explosive with the uranium bullet and target, and the tubes. So this was relatively straightforward for them to make. Okay, and this was the earliest design. So there were 2,000 pounds of TNT used as a trigger type of thing, and as the conventional explosive to mix the two parts. And the amount that was required was not too large type of thing, but the implosion bomb, that was the challenging part, was the plutonium. The amount was relatively small, but how to set up the chain reaction, and this was the amount of that was used. This is, you can see one of the scientists carrying the deadly cargo, how small the amount is for the, and this was actually the real picture of the amount that was used for Nagasaki. Okay. Now, again, and this was one of the political struggle that went on behind everybody's back was between collaboration that was originally agreed upon, but later on negated by the United States because they decided to go on their own. And so, but Churchill and FDR had special friendship, and to the chagrin of various American scientists and the military establishment, they decided to share the knowledge type of thing and encourage collaboration between the two parts. And it was again, so that was one of the reasons why the United States was able to share some of the information and use the British talent as an assistant because of their personal relationship that took place. Okay. And later on, towards the end of the war, when they decided that Germany did not have the bomb, and Niels Bohr, and being more wide-ranging thinkers, decided to meet Winston Churchill and talk about putting some of the to share some of the knowledge with the Allies, i.e. Russians. And Churchill obviously could not stand Niels Bohr and didn't give much credence to Niels' proposal. And Bohr said, along with various other wide-ranging thinking scientists, that some of the changes, this knowledge is not going to be kept secret and should be shared, and it should be kept, under some type of international control after the war, and to work, together. But Churchill, being an old Victorian, did not think much of the idea. He strongly wanted to keep the monopoly of Britain and America over the atomic thing, and wanted to work. Obviously, he was perhaps thinking ahead of the Cold War situation that that was brewing. But on the other hand, one time he actually liked Stalin, so it was an interesting relationship between the three powers to be. And this is, I think, I don't know how many of you are Anglophiles, but we talked with one of our other friends about Churchill's bomb, and this is written by an English physicist about Churchill's effort as to scientists who, again, he right from the beginning, he encouraged Britain to work with, and some of his scientific advisors, a guy named Lord Cherwell, he encouraged him to go ahead with the MOD project and the tube project that we talked about earlier. And so this is a book called Churchill's Bomb, and then we talked about the nuclear deal with FDR that we talked about a few minutes ago, and Niels Bohr effort, and so and Graham Farmiloe, who is a British physicist, and this is his work called Churchill's Bomb. So these are just a summary of what Graham Farmiloe, it's a long book, but he mentions. And we again talked about and not the least, the interesting thing that was going about, now we'll just introduce the subject of the spying that was going on, and the famous Cambridge 5, and the one that most of you may have heard about was, in several of them. The first one, that was John Cancross, and then and one of the women that was working in the British project of Spies was a woman named Melinda Norwood. And just as recently as a few years ago, there was a movie made starring Judi Dench called Red Joan, and it's based on the true story of so-called Granny Spy, Melinda Norwood. She was a civil servant, and she passed the secrets to Moscow, and she was exposed as late as 1999 at age 87, okay, about how much she worked for the Russians. And she believed that we were the allies, who were being not treated fairly. And so And obviously, she didn't gain too much. She wasn't out for monetary interest. A word or two about the so-called Quebec Agreement that took place between the United States and UK about pooling resources, free exchange of information, and again, that would, and this was rather obvious. Neither country, because they were allies, at least, and stayed allies for a long time, would not share information without others' consent, would limit. And now, sad to say, the French were not part of this because I don't know if we'll have time to talk more about the French role and the French going on their own way type of thing. And the French were instrumental in giving a lot of help to the Israelis in development of their bomb, including some of the raw material type thing. So, and but at least in the US and UK, tried to keep a tight lid on the information. Now, this is just one of those things that was of historical interest, that during the middle of the war, okay, and the Pope had, on one of his, addresses, had made, it to prevent, could lead to dangerous explosion. And how did the Pope get this information? Because perhaps from Max Planck, who was the giant of the German science and state Germany, and he was religious and had visited Pope. So this was as early as February of 1943. He had mentioned in his sermon about the sort of so-called uranium machine. That was the German word for the German project type of thing. So that might have been was kind of a breach of secrecy that would have taken place. So I think I'm coming up to my last slide type thing. So we should end a few minutes type of thing. So I think we're coming up to right 12, sorry. So we'll just stop here and continue next time. And I'll stick around for a few minutes as usual. And I think this is almost, I'm rehashing the material. So, okay, so I'll stop at this stage and I'll take questions and comments as